this is a story that many undoubtedly wish they could have told. How did this series of interviews come to be with Adrian?
Yeah, I pitched Adrian on the story probably early September. It took quite a while to sort out whether he was interested in doing it. I think his main holdup was that when he tries to explain himself in light of the child abuse case, a lot of the things he says end up sounding like excuses. Initially, he actually laid down a ground rule where he didn't really want to talk about the case. But I was surprised that in our very first interview, it was a subject that he addressed. It was almost like he wanted to talk about what he felt had happened and the aftermath of what he felt had happened. And it was like he kept coming back to it, even though initially he said he didn't want to. And so we first sat down, I would say, in October and ended up doing interviews all the way up through early December. So we ended up sitting down 5 times. And the result is, I think, what you see in the piece.
Yeah, you mentioned those parameters that his camp laid out for the interviews. He didn't want to linger on that abuse case from 2014, but you mentioned he kept circling back. Why do you think that was? Why did he keep coming back to something he initially told you he didn't want to talk about at all?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And just to clarify, him and I talked about the story like in person, and he himself said he didn't really want to talk about it. And then we sat down and did an interview. And one of the first things he talked about is in the piece was about his meeting with Roger Goodell in New York City in April, and how Goodell asked him what a whooping is, and how that sort of crystallized in his mind this sort of what he thinks is a cultural divide over how to discipline and parent kids. And so I was really surprised by that, but I think he kept coming back to it because I think on some level he feels misunderstood, and I think on some level he feels wronged, not necessarily by fans or people that think that he is a child abuser, but by the league that suspended him for 15 games, essentially, and by a judicial system that didn't initially press charges against him, but changed its mind after the Ray Rice video came out. And that is not to say absolve him of anything that happened by any stretch, but I think that on some level he's looking at this and saying, I want people to at least, at minimum, understand where I'm coming from. And some people, to be honest, never will.
And Adrian's background and where he's coming from is a big part of this story. You and Adrian spoke at length about the sad events in his life. What did you learn from this story that surprised you about Peterson?
A lot of it was just how he's able to kind of take all these events in his life and use them as sort of his motivation to play football. I think I look at what he's been through, and it's hard for me to look at these things as the same thing. He had a brother who was killed by a drunk driver when he was very young. He had a brother who was murdered before he ran at the NFL Combine. His father served 7 years in prison for selling crack. A son he didn't know was murdered in 2013. But he looks at just not just the loss, but also the injuries he had, the broken collarbones at Oklahoma, the ACL tear with the Vikings, this court case, and he looks at them all as sort of the same thing. That surprised me. I think that I don't want to trivialize the loss he's had in his life, because you look at those things and think maybe they're not all that much alike. But what he likes to do is sort of look at anything that happens to him, even things he did himself, even his own failings, and use it as sort of a fuel for the way he plays. And I think that a lot of great athletes have to find their motivation from different places. I've been doing this a long time. I've never encountered a guy that found his motivation this way and in quite this manner. And so that, I think, was the thing that stood out to me the most.
You spent quite a bit of time with Peterson. When he did talk about his son and the abuse case, what were his emotions like?
Yeah, I think that they really varied. At times he seemed a little bit befuddled by how strongly people reacted to him. At other times, he said that he could understand why people who saw the pictures from the case would never forgive him or would think of him as a monster moving forward. I think he contradicted himself some, and we tried to lay out some of those contradictions in the story. I think there were times when he was pretty even-keeled. I think there were times when he was really expressive. He has these very expressive eyes, and there were times that they really grew wide and very intense as he tried to kind of take me through what happened to him and what he felt he had done wrong and what he felt others had done wrong. And then I think there were times when he was more sad, and that would be more talking about how his son was killed by another man in 2013, and how then he had his own abuse case, and just how that all sort of played together. And there were moments he was pretty emotional. That would have been one of them, and there were moments when he was pretty defiant. So I would say it kind of ran the gamut, and it kind of depended on the day and the subject matter that we were delving into.
His emotions came across in some of his quotes. Some of them are going to grab some attention from the article. I'm going to read one of them to you here. Peterson told you, "I know in my heart there's not many fathers better than me. I'm that father that the kids run to. I'm the father they want to wrestle and play with." How do you think this type of quote is going to be received by parents around the country?
Well, not well, and I can tell you by my Twitter mentions this morning that it has not been received very well, even already. Now, I think that one of the things I think about the piece is that however you felt about Peterson going into it, you're probably going to feel the same way. If you felt like he's unforgivable, I don't think that your opinion will change by reading this piece. If you felt like it's complicated, I think you'll still find it to be complicated. And if you felt like he had a great season and we shouldn't be policing athletes as media, you're probably going to feel that way too. I can say that this morning I've gotten, 500, 1,000 Twitter mentions in the first couple hours since the story posted, and they're like 95% like, this guy's a child abuser. Why did you write about him? Why are we giving this guy a voice? He should be in jail, and all these sorts of things. So that doesn't really surprise me. I think we look at sports often in a binary way. I think there's good and evil, and we like our storylines to be neat, like this guy is totally wrong or this guy is totally right, and this guy's an evil guy and this guy's not, a good guy, a superhero. And I just personally think it's more nuanced than that. That's what I try to convey in the story, that there are layers to this that aren't meant to absolve him or give him free reign or allow him to think that he didn't do anything wrong. I think he does think that he did things wrong, and he has changed things about how he parents. And for some people, that's not going to be enough, and I get that too. But I just think the whole thing is pretty complicated, and I hope that comes across.
Now, you'd mentioned earlier Peterson talked with you quite a bit about his meeting with NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, where Goodell apparently asked him what a whooping was. How much of a disconnect do you think there was between Goodell and Peterson?
Well, I think it's fair to say that like Roger Goodell grew up in a different environment than most of the players in the NFL, and I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but I think we did see when Peterson was suspended that there were several dozen NFL players that voiced support for him, and I think that a lot of his peers in the league feel maybe differently than people in the league office did. Now, I'm not saying that to excuse what happened in his case. I'm saying that he looks at it as something that's a cultural misunderstanding. Now, that's an ethic misunderstanding with criminal proportions. So, I mean, I think that how you were disciplined by your parents is going to largely dictate how you feel about what happened with Adrian Peterson in this case. And I think that he went into that meeting already feeling like there was a cultural divide, already feeling like people in the league office didn't understand that, this is how he was raised. And again, that's not to absolve him. And I think that question for him crystallized it. Now, I think Goodell would probably say, and we tried to get him, but he didn't want to talk about it. I think he would say that he was just trying to understand that gap, to maybe bridge the gap by asking that question. So I think he probably didn't think he meant anything by asking it, but it really resonated with Peterson to the point where when he told me the story, he actually said, "Put that in there. I really want that to be in there," which was unusual and really the only thing he said that about.
I know you mentioned this in the piece, the influence of the Ray Rice situation. How much do you think the league's handling of the Ray Rice situation and the criticism towards the league played a role in the Peterson case?
I think it definitely played a role. I think the league would even admit to that. What we saw after the Ray Rice video came out is the league changed the way its discipline policy works. It made it so that it was less based on specific number of games and more based on a total feeling by Goodell, who's the arbiter, the judge, and the jury, and the guy who hears the appeal as well. So, I think you look at Adrian missed 15 games last year. Some of that was from suspension. Some of that was from while his court case was going on. People like to compare suspensions, and that's kind of a difficult thing to do. But, Greg Hardy missed 4 games. He was obviously accused of some pretty serious stuff. Rice's initial suspension under the old discipline policy was for 2 games, which I think is what sparked a lot of the uproar. So, it's tricky to kind of explain this without sounding like you're apologizing for his actions, but I think that there's no doubt that his suspension was longer and that he missed more time because that video came out and because the league changed his policy. That doesn't mean he didn't do anything wrong or that he didn't deserve to be suspended. I leave those judgments up to Commissioner Goodell and the people who make them. But, I think the climate of this is also an interesting facet of the story and one that we wanted to address in peace.
It is fascinating, a story with many, many layers. You can read Greg Bishop's full article on SI.com and, of course, in this week's issue of Sports Illustrated. SI senior writer Greg Bishop, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.